Hello again. I'm Dan Alasso. This is Making History. And as I mentioned yesterday, I am going to start thinking a little bit more about something that I've been interested in really from the beginning, or probably before the beginning of my actual study of history about a decade or so ago. And that is kind of the question of secular humanism and its role in history and in societies, especially America. And I ran into something today in my YouTube feed that I wanted to comment on. Bret Weinstein was on Dad Saves America. He did a two-part thing, and apparently what was released today was about 14 minutes excerpted from the second part. And he has some things to say about genetics. I mentioned Bret yesterday in my little introduction to this topic, and his idea that maybe there's something adaptive about religion. And so I want to dig into this a little bit with at least some preliminary thoughts, because he does talk about it in this. I'm going to quote kind of extensively from what Bret said, and then I'm going to comment on it. And Bret begins by saying, what I'm really describing is the mundane stuff of life, and I'm just standing in a place that you don't usually look at it from. And then he goes on to say that he and Richard Dawkins disagree over what he calls the lineage versus lineage displacement argument. And Bret begins to explain how he thinks evolution works in the cultural space. He says, the genes predispose us to function as if they want. So right away, he's saying that the genes don't actually want something, but we speak about them as if they do. And he says that this is something that Dawkins talked about also in his book, The Selfish Gene. He goes on to say, the basic point is your genes, which you have something like 20,000 active, your genes collaborate in a project that is you, including your brain. Your brain is very unusual amongst brains in nature because it is as unpreprogrammed as any species has ever been. It is not a blank slate, but it is as blank as a slate ever gets. And what that means, Bret says, is that there's a whole bunch of cognitive material that is passed not from the DNA, but passed in an entirely separate pathway that causes you to act in the interest of your genes. This is the point on which this is the reason that Dawkins and I disagree over the lineage versus lineage violence point. He thinks cultural evolution is independent of genetic evolution. I think it quite clearly cannot be. It has to do the bidding of genetic evolution, and therefore, the substance of something like a religious tradition is an evolutionary adaptation which predisposes us to act in ways that have served our genomes. Now, I'm going to have some comments on that, but let me show how Bret finishes his thought. He says, now, in many ways, having served our genomes is an excellent thing because it brought us to the present. It has endowed us with all of our characteristics, good and bad. Our tendency to commit violence and genocide, equally our compassion and our ability to envision a better future. These are all means to an end of genes trying to get into the future. And the point is, how do we get into the future? Well, really, there are two ways. One way involves collaborating with those who bring something to the table. The other way involves displacing people whose genes are spelled differently. Those two futures are so radically different in their quality and, frankly, their survivability that if we understand them as alternatives, we can only pick one, and we should fear anything that pulls us toward the other. Okay. I know that was a lot of Bret, and I will include the link so that you can watch the whole thing. And I'm looking forward to watching the half of the entire interview that it comes from. But let's unpack this a little bit. Bret's basic thesis, and where he disagrees with Richard Dawkins, seems to be that genetic evolution and the evolution of human cultures are the same thing and operate by similar or possibly even identical rules. Now, this is something that Dawkins seems to hint at in The Selfish Gene, in which Dawkins actually invents the term meme. But Dawkins also seems to regard this as a metaphor rather than as a reality. For Dawkins, this seems to be a way of thinking about how culture develops. Bret seems to be saying, nah, this is literal. So the idea that, quote, something like a religious tradition is an evolutionary adaptation which predisposes us to act in ways that have served our genomes, this idea is, I think, the natural outcome of this train of thought. It might be possible on this basis to argue that something like the Golden Rule, if it's actually acted upon, might confer survival benefits. That's interesting. In a lot of ways. It assumes free will, first of all, that people can choose to act in a certain way, and that if they do, their actions will have a bearing on their success in life and their ability or their greater likelihood to send their genes into the future. Of course, the Golden Rule of Christianity is very similar to the Silver Rule of Confucianism, which isn't a religion. So maybe the religion category is a little bit too narrow. Also, the hypothesis would actually need to be tested with historical evidence, right? To allow us to get a sense of whether a group that practiced a certain behavior actually had a different level of survivability or reproductive success. It occurs to me that another aspect of religion is the tendency to build communities. So maybe just that outcome, being part of a community and receiving its protection, is what enhances survival and reproduction. But I think this goes back to the thing that Bret was talking about in the first place. Where does being part of an inclusive group shade over into being part of an exclusive group? The whole point of Bret's explanation in this podcast is that he's trying to advocate for this potential future that embraces collaboration. He's making a sort of implicit claim that religion contributes to pushing people toward that collaborative future. And I think this is the claim that the conservative advocates of a return to faith that I was talking about yesterday would probably tend to agree with. But is it true? Does religion tend more often to bring people together into inclusive groups or to divide them into exclusive groups? In the historical record, doesn't a lot of what Bret calls lineage displacement use religious language and ideas to distinguish between us and them? As a historian, I am curious about how the idealistic claims that religions make and the perfected worlds that they look forward to and try to bring about would work, and how they motivate people. I'm also, perhaps even more, interested in what those religions actually did and how they affected the societies in which they existed. And I suspect that Bret is a little bit more optimistic about that than I am, but possibly based partly on what he chose to look at in history. I won't go all the way to saying that he hasn't looked too closely at history, because I don't know. And I'll examine my own biases too. Maybe I've been looking too closely at the negative aspects of the way that especially organized religions have operated in the societies in which they've been. Maybe there is a way to believe that the ideal has just maybe not been achieved in practice, but is still a realistic, achievable, and valuable goal nonetheless. So I will think about that, and I will talk about that some more in the future. But that's all for now. So I hope you found that a little bit interesting. Thank you very much for watching. I will see you again very soon.